Hello, everyone. Welcome to the FRIBIS workshop on basic income. We're just restarting the seminar for the summer semester after a couple of months off. And we are restarting with two presentations today. The first is by Simon März. He's the team coordinator for the FRIBIS team on Expedition Grundeinkommen. He researches the implementation of UBI pilot studies in Germany. He studied economics at the University of Beirut, Cape Town, and Freiburg, and he also studied theology in Redding, California. He specializes in developmental, constitutional, and public economics, and he holds a PhD. He holds that UBI has the potential to be a social reform, which may have the potential to be a framework for how individuals can achieve their full potential and their role in and their full potential and to become a more fully a full potential as a human being. So, Simon, take it away.
I will. I hope you guys hear me all loud and clear. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first share my screen, which has my presentation on it, and then we're going to go from there. I titled my presentation An Extensive Universal Basic Income Pilot Study in Germany, and I just wrote a paper on it where I critically analyzed it. And with field research, especially in the UBI realm, there's a lot of interesting things we haven't researched or we are about to research in the researching field. And hopefully later I'll have a bit more time to talk about its financialization. So how a UBI study, especially on a city level, on a municipal level, can be financed. And so there's certain ideas we have at the Götz Chair where I do my PhD right now, or at FRIBIS, and well, hopefully we get to it, but I'm not sure. So first of all, I'm just again the structure. First, I'm going to talk about this critical analysis of a proposed implementation of this pilot. I'm going to talk just a bit more about now. And then secondly, maybe we get to the financing of it, or my ideas with the financing of it. But we'll see. And maybe we can also discuss a bit more about it later, depending on how much time we'll have still. But I definitely wanted to put it in because for me, it's quite a nice idea. And it's something also I'd be interested what other researchers are thinking about. So, because I'm the first one, and I figured I'd just do a quick introduction into UBI. So for UBI, I defined it in my paper. By the way, the paper will be uploaded on our website as a discussion paper, so you can download it, especially when you want to look into sources or when you want to find out more about certain details, certain aspects of it. So yeah, feel free. We're going to upload it either this or next week, depending on how quickly you can do it, or I don't know the exact time, but it's going to be uploaded soon, most likely. So yeah, UBI in my paper defined as a policy proposal which basically ensures the governmental provision of a sufficiently high universal basic income to our citizens, regardless of economic circumstances, status of employment, age, gender, and health. And it ought to be paid as a cash transfer, not in kind. It's definitely not a new concept. Well, it's been dating back, and many of you guys might know that it's been dating back even to Thomas Paine and other researchers or writers in the 18th century. But it definitely picked up more in the 20th century. Martin Luther King even, in some aspects, was for something like a UBI. And then also Milton Friedman and his negative income tax made huge contributions to the UBI discussion. Well, when we talk about the negative income tax, the reason why I'm going to elaborate a bit on it is that the Expedition Grundeinkommen pilot will be based on a negative income tax model. So a negative income tax is pretty similar in total, it's pretty similar to UBI. The big difference between a negative income tax framework and a UBI framework is basically that when you receive a UBI, a universal basic income, you receive a payment to you, whilst with a negative income system, you're gonna, if your household income is below a certain threshold, below a certain level, then you will get tax rebates, basically money back from the tax office. And freedmen saw a chance to simultaneously eradicate poverty, avoid a welfare trap, and limit bureaucracy. So that's why he was pretty much for it. And his proposal led to quite a lot of basic income experiments in the starting in the 70s and 80s, which I'm going to elaborate a bit more later. So UBI, I also think it's becoming more and more a pretty hotly debated topic. Just if we look at the near past, we had the Swiss referendum in 2016, then Silicon Valley support for UBI, and Andrew Young running with a UBI proposal in his 2020 primary campaign election. And he got pretty far with it. So for me, maybe even surprisingly far. And especially with, and we're still in the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of economic problems have been unearthed. For a while, we had issues like rising income inequality or job precarity or entrenched poverty or health inequalities. But especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, it put a definitely more stronger strain on all of us, actually, and especially on the people who are the most vulnerable. And so these topics, rather than being things which many in the public wouldn't really be too strongly aware of, maybe especially in Europe, now have become quite openly, publicly debated topics, which makes it very interesting times to be a social policy researcher or UBI researcher. And yeah. And I also think that's one of the reasons why we will talk more about a UBI concept in the future, in public, also in the political sphere, which makes pilot research and UBI pilot research even more interesting for me personally. So, what is the pilot of the Expedit, or the proposed pilot of the Expedition Grundeinkommen? Basically, the pilot will run across several German municipalities. It will have, or it's planned to have, a treatment group of 10,000 participants, and it's scheduled to start in 2023. Probably it will most likely start in 2024. And it advocates for a basic income which covers basic living costs, because some basic income pilots in the past didn't cover basic living costs. But there will be, it also covers all social benefits. So whoever would receive a UBI payment would not receive extra social benefits. And it has basically a 1,200 euro threshold. So if a person would have no money, no income whatsoever, they would get the whole 1,200 euros. If they would have more than 1,200 euros, they wouldn't actually income, then they would not receive any income, but actually be taxed payers. But since in this pilot, they won't be paying taxes, they just won't receive any UBI payments. So then you could argue, yeah, it's not really a basic income for everyone. That is true, that's an argument. However, basically they do that to simulate what would happen if the entire population would get a basic income, because there would be also a big fraction of the population which would pay more than they would receive. But if that is unclear, I'm very welcome to discuss it later, because maybe some people didn't get the idea of an NRT tax or how it works. So I think I just leave it there for now. And maybe if questions come up, I definitely can explain it better later. So yeah, and the idea is also that there will be a flat tax between either 40 or 50%, which they haven't decided on the exact number, but it's either going to be between 40 or 50%. Yes. Well, before I'm going to talk about why, in my opinion, it makes sense to do that pilot, and that's what I also discussed in the paper, I figured I'd talk a bit about the political economy of a UBI pilot implementation. A pilot doesn't happen in a political vacuum. There's always going to be debate about it. And any pilot has also quite a lot of risk involved. So politicians could abuse a implementation process to get more support rather than wanting to deliver a national UBI. They could just basically advocate for the implementation of a pilot and then basically be fine for the next 2 years, because they would always be able to tell their constituents that, hey, right now we have a pilot, we don't need to implement a pilot into national law. And then the next step between a pilot and an implementation into law is actually pretty big. It never happened before. So what I'm trying to say with that is the fact that we have pilots and we had pilots in the past doesn't necessarily mean that those pilots will then result into an implementation into national or even supranational laws. So far, we did not have any UBI concept whatsoever in any country, as far as I know. Yeah. Also, researchers, when they introduce a pilot or when they basically talk about the pilot in public, they have to be aware that media reception can also sometimes be quite different than they expect it to be. So we had that in the 1970s in the US during and after the experiments. They had actually quite a hostile reaction and a hostile media reception towards either the recipients or their results, even though initially a lot of people were quite interested in doing NRT research, NRT pilots. So with that, they have to be really, wise about it. And many times, also what I have later in the slides, you can see it, that there's usually a mix up between like ethical discussions and econometric/empirical discussions. And so it's wise for the researcher to split these two discussions in two. To first talk about the ethical reasons or maybe discussions around UBI, and then also talk about the results and econometric reasons later. But also, and that is very important in my opinion, but also in actually Karl's opinion as well. I took that from your book, Karl. It's very important that researchers need to clearly point out the limitation of such a study, because there's a lot of topics a UBI pilot cannot address. It always has, for example, most pilots and also this pilot are randomized control trials, meaning you have a treatment group and you have a control group and they both randomly chosen. But we know very little about other macroeconomic factors which surround the whole pilot, which will definitely influence the results. So that's something you definitely can't research. You cannot research long-term effects. There's also a lot of other effects, interactive effects, which you cannot research in a pilot. But these things are very interesting to the public, and so at least to make sure that the public understands it very well. What a pilot can do and what it cannot do, these limitations need to be communicated very well. So how I went about to argue for this pilot, or to research actually if it's valid, scientifically valid to do another pilot, is I first created an inclusion framework, and it's very close to the framework of Gibson and Gibson et al. And so basically what I did is I looked at the pilots of the last 60 years in the upper middle and highly industrialized countries. For that, for that kind of classification, please look at the country classification from the World Bank this year. And what I said is I'm only going to include pilots which show universality, permanence, unconditionality, and payments which are fixed in value and provide basic subsistence, meaning they will actually provide an actual full basic income. And just some general results, because I figured why not just give some general results of that study before. So basically there is an impact of UBI on the labor participation with varying degrees and varying outcomes. So on one hand, with the old studies on the NLT experiments, and we are going to talk about them just now in detail, they were basically saying that there is a fairly strong reduction, especially for people, for second owners. So in a normal, say 60s and 70s model, that would be the first primary owner would be usually husbands, or like the male head of the home, and the secondary owners would usually be their wives or partners. And but then if you look at more recent studies, that actually isn't the case. So usually what we have there is that, yeah, we do have an impact, but we're not actually entirely sure if it's not even maybe positive rather than negative. When we talk about impact on child development, that was something else which stood out for me. We know that teenagers stayed longer in school than their peers, and also that they were less likely to engage in criminal behavior if their parents or the household would receive a UBI. And interesting enough, these effects were much more pronounced in lowest income and at-risk groups than compared to a normal other social equality or social measures we had before, or we would look at before. We also have an impact on health. So we usually can see better health, better mental health, and also significantly lower rate of doctor visitations. That was especially in that one UBI pilot in Canada. I'm going to just talk about it again. And yeah, so basically, if you look at it in detail, we look at I think it was better health was mostly seen in the, I think in the Manitoba basic annual income experiment. That was the one, or the one before, Gary. No, it was the Manitoba one. Yeah, so basically we have, these are the 5 big ones. The New Jersey graduate work experiment, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to actually read through all of them, but these are the big NIT income tax experiments in US and Canada in the between 1968 and 1980. And generally the large RCTs, as I said before, and they tested different levels of guaranteed income and different levels of tax rates. So basically, they would tax these different rates to determine how effective different income rates and different tax rates are on the incentive or disincentive to work for the recipients. And in general, the locations of these NIT studies I elaborated on quite well. I basically wrote more about it in my paper, so please have a look at it if you're interested. But in general, they're mainly impoverished areas with also impoverished participants, and that is one of my key criticisms. Not criticisms, but that's actually why I think they can't really compare to a UBI pilot in Germany, which would spread about across different places in Germany, because basically all the study sites show to be impoverished areas, and the reason is if you have impoverished, well, basically if you have an impoverished area, then most people in that area would be also poor, obviously, and then they would most likely reduce their working hours much more significantly than someone who would just be of a medium income. And that's why their response then is bound to be much higher than an average response. There's also several methodological issues, which I'm don't really unfortunately have the time to go into, even though it's quite interesting, but maybe we can come back to it later. And then there's also the UCTs, the unconditional cash transfers. In my work, I did not include the Alaska Permanent Fund or the Macau's Wealth Partaking Scheme or the Iran fuel subsidy. Actually, the Iran fuel subsidy is quite interesting because initially it would be around 29. So the payments would be around 29% of a medium income adjusted for purchasing power. But then because of inflation over 3 years or 4 years, that amount much more than halved. So then you can't really see it as a basic income anymore. But there is other studies, other unconditional cash transfers, which are mostly called tribal casino dividends. but also with them, as before, either so we see that in the Foley study, for example, the problem with I have with the Foley study is that I don't see it as generalizable. So they 16 randomly chosen tribal members are compared to 20 non-Native Americans. You don't know if these tribal members actually do represent the entire population. The same goes for Kodesh as well, where he compares 12 tribal chiefs and 24 tribal members. And yeah, it goes with a lot of other studies as well in that. Also talked about the Kona and Taggart studies, where we have a sample split, which makes unequal subsamples, but also the Bruckner study, where he compares a control group of 57,000 individuals with 70 interviewees. That's how you do it. Yeah, and also other studies found the exact opposite of it. So I also wouldn't really say that these studies can be used to say like we cannot use another, we cannot conduct another pilot study in Germany. Yeah, so moving on. There is other pilot studies, therefore also had to exclude because they would focus on well, some would focus, for example, the Keller experiment would focus on mostly, well, only solemnly on unemployed people. So that's why I couldn't include them, or I included, also excluded the pilot study in Kenya because it's in Kenya, and Kenya is not really that well comparable in my opinion, but that's also debatable with a German context. However, I did include the Y Combinator pilot in the States, and also a planned pilot in Scotland, and a pilot which is going on right now in Germany. However, my criticism towards the Y Combinator pilot, for example, is that they have a defined age range from, I believe, 21 to 40. And also they focus on individuals which are below, in households which are from households which have a below national median income, so basically poorer households, which for me doesn't make it universal. And then in the Scottish pilot, that basically is also an NIT. They also have an NIT approach, but it's basically they have a tax bracket of £12,500. What I like about them is they have a feasibility study before, but my problem with their suggested UBI payments is that their payments are very close to a welfare benefit payments, or to very close to welfare benefit payments. Sorry, and so yeah, plus some, even with the basic income payments, there would also be some existing payments as well. And so yeah, I think that really introduces a very low bargaining bar, and that mostly will, in my opinion, might actually be very well bargained down to the fact that they might not even introduce the UBI in Scotland, even though they have a scheme for it, because basically many politicians could say, and that's what I see as a danger in it. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the danger with it, what I do see is that it might not even happen, because most politicians could say like, yeah, well, we already have welfare payments. Why would we pay a basic income which is very close to the welfare payments anyway? Yeah, but then last but not least, we have a pilot project, Grundeinkommen, which is going on right now. And there basically we have a treatment group of 120 people receiving 1,200 euros, and a control group which receives no payments. Generally, I really like their research right now. But what happens is that they're, so basically they have a subsum of 20,000, which they randomly drew out of 1 million. But it's limited, again, the age range is limited from 21 to 40, and it's only single person households. So again, it's not universal, but I like their approach, and I think their approach is good. It's statistically sound, but unfortunately, again, the results are not generalizable for the entire German population. Yeah, sorry, that was a bit loud. Yeah, so much about looking into the question if it is scientifically beneficial to do this pilot? My opinion is yes, but again, that's why for me it's a discussion paper. It's up for discussion. That's why I presented as well. I guess technically I still would have like 5 minutes to talk about a financialization idea, Karl, right? Or should I just rather stop here? What do you think?
You can talk for 5 more minutes if you need, sure.
Yeah. So I have another, like loads of other slides, probably over 20 slides, but I knew I'm not gonna get into it as much. Basically, there's also an idea right now, which is for me a development research idea. And it is right now it's focused on Germany and the German fiscal structure. And it's trying to answer the question how a city / a municipality can fund such a basic income pilot through federal funds, so through federally allocated funds. And yeah, the idea, I would probably have laid it out a bit more. So I'm just gonna jump through the different slides to get to a point where I can quickly talk about it. There's a certain procedure with it, what they can do, and so need to know that. But I'm just going to jump over this. So basically, the idea is really that the federal government is able to directly pay municipalities. That would be the theory. Right now with German fiscal law, that's not possible unless they do a specific new payment scheme. And so what the community, what the municipality then could do, they could use they could use the allocated taxes, the allocated community taxes. They could do it from the income tax, but also from the value-added tax, and also from the capital gains tax. The problem with the capital gains tax is quite low in terms of volume, and the income tax is pretty high in terms of volume of income. So that's why they could use it, but that's only possible for municipalities which have people who are quite wealthy in the municipality. So that wouldn't work for all German municipalities. So in terms for other municipalities, we would have to design another scheme here. That's that's a quick look at the municipality's tax income. So basically, what we see in B is that there is a lot of so B 38% on the left. If you look at the pie chart at the left, there is a lot of payments a municipality gets from either the federal state or the highest entity in Germany, which is the federal state, either from the federal state or the federated states, which is the like lower level of. You can also compare it to like the American states and the federal government. So they already get a lot of payments, and they could use these payments straight away if they want to do a UBI in their city or municipality. And that's the idea, basically. I've just started very roughly because otherwise would have to go into detail. It is easier than raising new taxes because there's much less opposition to it. And there's other examples we already have in German law. Since many viewers might not be as knowledgeable about German law, I'm just actually gonna jump over that. But a lot of Corona payments actually showed that it is possible that the state can support municipalities straight away, and so that gives us a good idea of how that could be done to fund a pilot. Yeah. So let's just So I'm jumping through it a bit. I said most of these things already. So the crux really is it's not that difficult for affluent municipalities because they can create a financing mixture of value-added taxes, income taxes, and also taxes that a municipality can raise. So that is quite possible for them, and that's can be done quite easily, but the problem is really for less affluent municipalities. So for them, I propose a mixed form of tax financing, which utilizes a lot of equalization payments, and also what has to be or ought to be included, and that would have to be calculated, is really the potential savings such a UBI system would be. And all these things need to be really done in detail because the devil really is in the detail here, but for me, it's quite an interesting approach of how a city could quickly and easily finance a UBI. Yeah, so much about that. And yeah, just thank you for your attention. And again, if you guys are interested in the sources or discussion, please visit the FRIBIS website. So basically just Google FRIBIS Freiburg. And then you also see it here on the right on the slide. That's our logo. And we're trying to get that paper up in the next time as soon as we can.
Okay, please unshare your screen.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll go now. We have a student discussant who will get the discussion rolling. This is Niharika Joakar, who is a master's student in economics at the University of Freiburg in Freiburg, Germany. And she is currently taking my seminar in the economics of UBI experiments. So take it away, Niharika.
Thank you.
Niharika.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank
Niharika.
you. Yeah, Niharika. Hello. So yeah, I like how you have discussed in your paper about how a UBI experiment is needed in Germany, especially because since there was already one that has already happened, and the others that have been conducted in other countries, and how today there has been a change in the perspectives, or rather an advancement by researchers and even policymakers in analyzing and testing empirical data. And then you talked about the points where UBI experiment that it cannot address. And one of the points which was listed by Professor Widerquist, I feel like this is kind of like a Schrodinger's cat situation, because one of the point which was with respect to the issue of if the worker exploitation would increase or decrease. And I feel like we really wouldn't know this until a UBI experiment is implemented on a full scale, right? But yeah, I do have a few more questions, and I think I'll go according to how the paper progresses. And would you want me to ask them one by one, or do you want me to ask them all at once?
That's a good question.
One at a time, please.
Okay.
Probably I was going to say that as well. Yeah.
To get them all at once, and also that will give the audience a chance to get involved in each topic.
Okay. So the first one is that you have written about moral arguments in favor of UBI and that they have not received much attention. So is it so that these socio-ethical arguments were probably seen or put forth in an experiment that had, say, participants from a particular participants from a subgroup which had a particular social status, or maybe the community or the country in which these experiments were conducted had a particular characteristic or ideology, and that is why these arguments are not maybe a strong argument? Is that the reason?
That's a great question, by the way. Thank you. Well, generally, thank you for the questions, because that's what I do. It's like I write a thing and then I get feedback on it. So thank you so much for it. Well, I think I'm more so in the general discussion on UBI. What I've seen, maybe that is my economics bias, let's say this way. What I see a lot of times is that we have strong economic discussion around it, like, is it financeable? How can we finance and all these things? But actually, when I think about UBI, a lot of times, a lot of psychological reasons come up as well, and also moral reasons. And I mean, Karl can write a book on it. He actually wrote books on it. So I think it's very, very important. These discussions are very, very important, and they are actually held as we speak right now. So there's in California, there is a proposed UBI for I think LGBT members. So these discussions are held in different countries, but I think compared to the general discussion and how the public really receives it right now, I feel, and that's more personal feeling, is that these are really almost under discussed compared to questions of how can we finance this and what is going to happen to our economy, things like that. Yeah, hopefully I could answer that question with it.
Yeah, thank you. And so my next question was, so even today you mentioned about the COVID-19 crisis and how it has revealed poverty, precarity, and even inequality. And since this experiment is to begin in 2023, and so how do you think COVID-19 crisis, if it's completely over, or maybe if it worsens, I mean, I hope it does not, how do you think it would affect this particular experiment? Do you think it would maybe overestimate the results? Like you said, with the participants who are from the impoverished subgroup, they kind of overestimate the results. So do you think it would also happen if COVID-19 crisis, say, worsens?
Exactly. So I don't actually think it's going to do much to the results itself, because again, as you said, that the crisis itself is over. I think, and that's a good feedback. Maybe I didn't make it as clear in my paper. My idea was, and that was like an introduction into the UBI discussion, is that I think, well, because, or let me rephrase it, because of the COVID-19 crisis with challenges for all of us, but then especially, I mean, that's like most basic economic research would also say that with especially vulnerable subgroups, we saw that, I mean, a good example is artists, people who own cafes, things like that. These people really kind of like almost fell off the cliff and really struggled, and will probably continue to struggle for a long while. And so what I was trying to say is that these things have been there and are still there and will be there, maybe even more so in the future. But because of the crisis, these things actually became quite obvious to the public, and that the public understood, hey, maybe we have to do things different in the future. And that, for me, probably might raise the support even higher for UBI, because the thing with a pilot really is that you would like to do a pilot, but what do you do a pilot for? You want to know what a UBI does in the future, so you can maybe either decide to have it as a national law or not. And in order to really do an effective pilot on such a scale as I proposed, you really need a strong public support for that. And that's probably why I think the COVID-19 crisis plays into this.
Okay, can I interrupt before you go on to your next question, Niharika? I don't have so far any questions from our Zoom audience, but I do have a question. At least if anybody's trying to raise their hand, I don't see it. So send me a comment. If you're just say raise your hand in the comments section if you've been trying to raise your hand unsuccessfully. But I do have a question that comes in from YouTube, which I have to relay by reading it. Someone watching on YouTube, Hans Florian Hoyer, says, as far as I know, the current system of Soziale Marktwirtschaft was put into action without any pilot study. What is it that, why, I think it means that why is it that UBI seems to need pilots in the context of so many other things that have been put into place without ever being piloted? Now, I have some opinions on that, but I'm the host, so I'll turn that over to y'all.
Yeah, I'm smiling about because I'm aware of your opinions, Karl. Actually, the thing is, what I'm how do I say this? I'm trying to keep myself out of this discussion, because I see the pros and the cons of a pilot, of a UBI pilot, and so because there is cons, what I'm trying to argue really is that there needs to be a certain a big enough amount of pros for me to finance such a vast and big pilot. I mean, if you have 10,000 participants, there's going to be there's money involved in this, and yeah, that's a good. I mean, honestly, like, I don't really know, because it's not really part of my paper, so it's something I would maybe have to discuss another time. But I mean, there is a lot of cons and pros for having a pilot. I think because of the current circumstances and the current framework I was trying to lay out, I think there is a strong pro. But I mean, yeah, eventually if we have an introduction of UBI into national law, then we don't need any pilots. So if that would be a thing, then yeah, we wouldn't really need to do that. And part of that we do see. And so, for example, just another prominent research on UBI, SHUB, actually just argued 2 weeks ago, or maybe last week, actually, I don't know, must have been 2 weeks ago, that he actually sees an introduction of different kinds of social measures, like a universal. We're talking about in German. We're talking about a universal. Sorry, I'm blanking. Universal income for children, for example, instead of a German Kindergeld, which used to be there before. Now we have a universal income for all parents without any check of income whatsoever. So there is things like that happening as we speak, but we don't have a strong breakthrough yet. So I mean, yeah, there's great arguments for saying we don't need pilots at all, but there's also arguments for saying we do need pilots. So it's a bit like, yeah, I think that's where we're at now.
Okay, Niharika, please go on to your next question.
Okay, so this is my last question. So in the conclusion of your paper, I read that the German municipal and federal government officials are working closely with the researchers. And you also said that today, like in this PPT, that you mentioned that experiments cannot work in a political vacuum. And since this experiment begins in 2023 and goes on for next 3 years, and the next federal elections are to be held in 2025, and so I wanted to ask if there's a change in political party or maybe the ideology of the same political party. I mean, I'm not really aware of the political situation in Germany, and I apologize for that. But do you think this might have a huge impact on the experiment, especially because the two interest groups, the researchers and the political stakeholders, are working together, and since the results would be out only after the elections?
That's a great question. Actually, it happened in the past. So we have a UBI pilot in Ontario in 2018, where they started the pilot and then the government changed and they stopped the pilot. So yeah, so that's actually why, as a researcher, especially here with when we research constitutional economics and the chair and Mr. Neumacher's chair, what I'm part of doing my PhD right now, you would and you want to create a system which becomes almost immune to that. So basically, you would then have it's almost can see it almost like a contract. You would be like, hey, we are going to do this thing, and we only going to start this thing if it's immune to political opinion. So you would basically say, hey, this is going to start from the beginning and to the end, and then and that's how you can say from these things. But if you wouldn't do that, and this has happened several times in the past, then this can be. So yeah, I mean, if the political opinion changes in the country, it could easily change as well. But that's why you try and integrate frameworks which actually prevent exactly that.
So is this experiment immune to that, in your opinion?
Well, that's what I'm actually researching. Good question. So
okay.
Well, to be honest, it's something I'm looking into right now. I'm trying to create it like that, and then it can only become immune when you basically decide it to be like that. So you would have to create it in a way that it is immune, and that has to literally be. You can almost see it as like a contract. Then that would actually be made into. It wouldn't be law, but it would be like a. I actually don't remember its name right now, but it would almost be like you can make it almost like a law, if I'd say this like that, and then yeah, it would just have to go until the end, and then be and then the results would have to be interpreted and all these things. But again, if there's political pressure, and as I wrote this even in my paper, political pressure can even influence the results. So yeah, it definitely will have an influence, but you're trying to prevent it from being cancelled too early. That's the biggest idea, yeah, behind it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, this was all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Jurgen De Wispelaere wants to get in on this topic. Jurgen?
Hi, hold on, let me just switch my video thingy here on. Okay, thanks for that, Simon. That was really interesting. I have a bunch of general questions, but I'll leave those for later. Just in response to so I have a question on your kind of the last question that Niharika put forward, but also the previous one. So the two questions I have is, one, yes, there might be all sorts of good reasons not to do a pilot, but if we weren't doing a pilot, what would we be doing? Right. Basically, in my view, we would be sitting in the basement just chatting to each other. unfortunately. So I think that so we really do need to take into account what is the fallback option here. And then secondly, I mean, I like so two small points on the sort of the constitutional contract type of argument, right? So the one thing, it might be interesting to look at what's going on in Catalonia at the moment. So the Catalans too are putting forward a big project that will be in the whole region. One of the things they've done is they actually set up a separate office, right? So this is not run through existing office, so to speak. They actually set up a separate office with a separate staff and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of sort of administrative type of things that are interesting to put forward. But my biggest worry is, I mean, in one sense, yes, Ontario was an extreme case, right? The cancellation very abrupt in the most silly way ever. I mean, without any good reasons, even not bothering to give any good reasons and so on and so forth. But what we actually see in a lot of other experiments is that, yes, they happen, and yes, they are, evaluated, and then it all just disappears, right? So Finland, for example, is a good case. I mean, so how do you have any ideas of how do we protect, if you like, how do we protect the integrity of the experiment throughout the whole policy process? So not just it being cancelled, but is there anything that we can do that you have in mind to actually sort of ensure that this is taken very seriously as governments evolve and so on and so forth, right? Because I mean, one of the biggest issues is that, I mean, experiments take a few years, but in political time, that, politics goes very, very fast, right? Things can change very, very rapidly and so on and so forth. So,
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, what I do see right now with and that's what I liked. That's actually why I used my Gründer Common as an example. I see them having a lot of public just attention. It's quite interesting, quite remarkable. If I would talk to a lot of friends, and I'm specifically try to talk to friends who are not as interested in the case that we have public attention. And I think public attention really makes it kind of like keeps it interesting, keeps it floating. That's from the top of my head what I would say makes it robust against negative political impacts. I mean, I also wrote in my paper that I think researchers really have to be aware of public receptions really well. I mean, we saw it. I mean, Finland actually tried to do it really well in being like having a press conference and for this, and then it just basically disappears. You said it exactly well. And I think what I like about the expedition Gründerkommen, they basically they basically have 10, 15 staff just working on promoting it. And also what I like is that it's done in different cities, that it's done similar at the same time. And so for me, the best, really that's off the top of my head, but it's a great question. So I'm actually going to take this down in my research is, I would say that's the biggest factor going for them, and also having different kinds of municipalities be involved. So that in this year would be, for example, Berlin, Hamburg, Bremen. These are all big cities in Germany, and so their plight really is to keep the public interested, and that is also one of the things we're trying to specifically do at FRIBIS, that we work with, as researchers, we work with the public. We're trying to also have public discussions on it, and my hope really, and especially that's also why I put it in the context of Andrew Young's primary elections. I do have a feeling that the public is much more pro now than it used to be, for example, maybe even in 2017. And so, yeah, that's what I would say right now. But again, it's a great question. I'm definitely going to take it up and look deeper into it.
Okay, I have a couple people with their hands up looking to ask a question on a new topic. And please correct my pronunciation. Anush Rita would like to ask a question next.
Thank you, Professor. Anu is just fine. My question, I have two questions actually. The first one is, so you've mentioned in your paper that for this particular experiment, the basic income will cover all formerly received social benefits, so that a recipient does not receive any further social welfare payments. You're diminishing the need for receiving any payments that were otherwise were incoming to the people. Do you think
you know, throughout this experiment, when you're replacing UBI with something that was existing before, does that induce some kind of maybe a backlash or a criticism from the people who participated in the experiment?
Exactly, and actually, even it has things which I'm still. The good thing about that that pilot right now, it's promoted, but we actually still have to look at important details which will be perceived for the public in a negative way. So, for example, if you have someone who struggles with severe disabilities, you can't just take away his support by the state, because he would actually have major financial problems and all kinds of things that actually would be really bad. So these are things you can't do, and that's actually great that he's saying it, because I forgot to mention that in the paper. In this case, there would be bracket options like that, where you that coverage can't be changed. But I mean, in terms of percentages, that would be like 5 to 10% of social welfare recipients. I mean, excluding people who receive anyway. So that basically it is, you would have to create bracket options also for people who are retired as well, and it's something which is actually being discussed right now as we speak. So yeah, but it's definitely something which needs to be communicated really well as well in the future, and it's something I'm actually gonna talk to my colleagues at the UB Expedition Grundeinkommen, because if that does not communicate well, then you already have the public against you for good reasons, you know?
Yes, absolutely. So my second question is, you've in the paper, you've mentioned a bit of the experiment done by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. You've mentioned how the field experiments also examine how the institutional context are introduced into reacts to the introduced policy experiment. Could you expand a bit more on that?
Well, basically, I mean, Duflo they're really good in their research in their field, and you know, when you talk about poverty economics and the stuff like that. And so when you interesting, what they've found out is that sometimes when you have new measures, you also need to test, if you start this measure, how specifically the government and people around the government actually react to that measure. And that's what I liked about their approach, is that it's not just introducing something, but you also test not just the participant, but you also look at how does this interact with the environment around that. And I love the approach on that. And that is why it's something I picked up as well, because as researchers, we just shouldn't be, say, like linear in our thinking, but we actually need to be aware of our surroundings. That's what I'm trying to say with it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, now I'll go on to our next questioner, which is Johanna. Johanna, please unmute and turn your video on and ask your question.
Johanna? Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'll do it like this. Sorry. I have some technical difficulties, but hopefully you can hear me now. We
can hear you. Please feel free to turn your video.
It's not, it's not really working. I'm sorry.
No.
I have a question about the practical implementation, and please correct me if I got some of the dates wrong. So I've heard that the pilot is supposed to be implemented in multiple municipalities, including Berlin, Hamburg, Bremen, with about 10,000 people, and that there are political stakeholders involved also in the research design, but they are from different municipalities, thus probably from different parties and different governments of the respective municipalities, and that the sample should be representative and starting in 2023. So I'm just wondering, wow, that's a lot, or it seems a lot. How, I guess is my question.
Well, exactly. That's a great question. And now you feel how I feel. To be honest, that was the initial plan, 2023. That's why I wrote it into my paper. That was a plan till beginning of this year, and I started to write this paper at the beginning of this year. So I figured I'm going to put 2023 in this now. Honestly, I think it's going to be 2024 for that reason, and for other reasons as well. So The thing is also the reason also why I'm a bit undecided if it's 2023 and 2024, because on one hand, the Expedition still is saying it ought to start in 2023, but again, practically, I think it's going to start later. I think it's going to start 24, maybe if things go badly, maybe 25 even. Yeah, but what happens is normally with German direct democracy measures is that you have a Volksentscheid, which is a public vote on either to introduce a BI or not, or UBI or not. And what happens normally is that you have to do it in a certain time span after that public vote. And usually that ranges from a year, it ranges from half a year to things like 2-3 years. So there is a certain time span after the vote will be done. And the first round until that vote will be is this year. So basically then in 2023, next year, there would be done with that vote. Ideally speaking, if we, for example, talk about these 3 different cities, which are also Länder in Germany as well, and then from there on, you probably would take half a year to implement it. So now we're talking about 24 exactly. So, but yeah, I mean, like once that vote is in and it is positive, so it's basically that the citizens of these cities say they want to have a BI in their respective city, then yeah, you would have to work very closely, and then it's going to be a lot of work to do that. But it is doable. I mean, these things are done and they were done in the past. I mean, the Scottish, for the reason that the Scottish pilot it was constructed in 1 year, when we still in the construction phase, and then no, it was constructed in 2 years, but then they had a feasibility study before as well. So with that, they're quite far ahead compared to the Expedition comment, but it's something they're working on as we speak. Yeah. So, but I think it's feasible, but it's definitely going to be a lot of work.
Okay, we're rapidly running out of time. Jurgen, if you can answer a question in less than a minute, and it has to be a question that Simon can answer in less than 2 minutes, then we can ask your question. Otherwise, we should move on.
Okay, no pressure. Okay, I really have a few questions here, but I'll very simple one. I'm very intrigued about all these proposals that say we give people a basic income, you know, as part of an experiment, and we cut the social benefits. And I see a lot of problems with that because number one, you know, some social benefits are at the remit of municipal level, some are states, some are federal. So how do you deal with the competence issues? Number two, you need to be able to guarantee that after the experiment is done, that people can immediately get access to these social benefits. And some social benefits are set up in a way that makes that impossible, right? Often with waiting periods and so on and so forth. So how do you handle that? And number three is a lot of social benefits also serve a gateway function. So for example, some social benefits counts towards your pension, and then the basic income experiment thing doesn't. Right, so there's a lot of really tricky things we need to figure out when we say, oh yeah, but we're going to give them a basic income and we're just going to cut the social benefits, everything. So I have no idea how that works in the German context. This is very country specific, but I kind of just wanted to flag that as something that really is very difficult to do in most countries, right? So.
Exactly. That's actually why I just talked about the Scottish example as well. I'm more and more trying to get into touch with them, to be honest, because, and that's what they wrote in the publication, is that they have a framework already in place where people once the pilot is done, then they're able to get onto it. So this is things like in the German framework, it's a bit easier because there's certain payments which are strictly by the federal government and certain payments by the city. So that is already split up, and then you would just basically combine it. But yeah, I mean, that's something. An interesting thing is, for example, when you have payments from the federal government, you would then have to talk to the federal government, be like, hey, is this payment rather going to be a UBI payment? So there's a lot of details in that, which then, you know, you would have to negotiate. And it's fascinating for an economics researcher, but it's also tricky. And so I think in that, for exactly how to do the details, I would have to maybe refer you to researchers about the Scottish Parliament experiment. But it's something I honestly still have to look much more into detail as well. So great question, and thank you for saying
So
it.
you know that there actually doesn't exist a Scottish pilot experiment, right?
Yeah, it's not happening. It's
There exists the
proposed.
feasibility studies, but
exactly.
I mean,
yeah.
I mean that stuff is kind of cut through, right? So
yeah. I mean, yeah. So that's what I meant. Sorry, it's not a pilot experiment which is running, but it's a proposed pilot experiment. So, but even just from a framework standpoint, it's very interesting. So that's why I would like to.
I agree.
Okay.
Thanks.
We've got to cut it. We've got to cut it here. We've got to take. We've already overrun 5 minutes, and in discussion with Tobias, our technical manager, we're going to take a full 10-minute break. So actually, Jurgen and Simon, you will start 5 minutes late at 5:10. So everybody can have a nice little break here. We'll all see you at 17 hours 10 minutes. Central European time. Let's go to the break.
Wer ist 2320? Yeah, wait. Oh, I'm going to call him. Simon, clam for you. Sorry. Okay. He's doing it now. You can still hear us probably.
Okay, we are back to start the second half of today's seminar, and we'll start it with a joint presentation by Jurgen De Wispelaere and Simon Birnbaum. I will introduce them in reverse order, with Simon Birnbaum, who's going second, is an associate professor and senior lecturer in political science at Södertörn University in Sweden, and an affiliate researcher at the University of Future Studies in Stockholm. He's published extensively on social justice, on basic income, the universal welfare state, and sustainability, and he's written 2 monographs related to those issues, which are Basic Income Reconsidered, Social Justice, Liberalism, and the Demands of Equality. The other book is The Generational Welfare Contract, Justice, Institutions, and Outcomes. Before joining Södertörn University, he has worked as a lecturer and researcher in the Department of Political Science at Stockholm University. Our other member of the presentation team is Jurgen De Wispelaere, who is a true world scholar. He holds a doctorate in social sciences or social policy from the University of Tampere in Finland. He's an assistant professor at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga, Estonia, and an adjunct professor in philosophy and social policy at Tampere University in Finland. His main areas of expertise is in political theory and public policy, with a particular interest in welfare state research and social protection. Before moving to SSE Riga, he also held visiting or permanent work or fellowships at the University of Bath and the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, at McGill University and the University of Montreal in Canada, at Trinity College Dublin and University College Dublin in Ireland, at the Southern University of Denmark, at the University Autónoma de Barcelona in Catalonia, Spain, at the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium, at the Australian National University, at Columbia University in the United States, and he's currently also working as a consultant for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean to produce a report on basic income or guaranteed income schemes in Latin America. And he's coming to us today from Valdivia, the city in southern Chile. So from southern Chile, take it away, Jurgen.
Thanks, Karl. Thanks for the invitation. Let me just give me a sec here to share my screen. Hold on a sec here. We have a presentation. Oops. Okay. Can you see this okay? Yes?
Yes, we can see it good.
Great. Okay, so and I'm going to also put my timing thing on so I don't lose total track. Okay, right, great. First of all, Karl and FRIBIS, thanks very much for hosting us and giving us the opportunity to present our paper. So this is going to be, a double presentation between Simon and me. I mean, think of it as a rock concert. So I'm going to be doing the warm-up session, support group. And then the real rock and roll will happen when Simon gets on. And I guess Karl is doing some comments after, so that could be like the, the VIP after party or something like that. So, but we'll have a lot of fun. So this is what we're going to be doing. So we'll look at, I'm going to be talking about some preliminaries, and I'll talk about something that we call the exit strategy. And then Simon will look at 2 sort of big issues that are really the arguments that we have against this sort of exit strategy. So this is sort of the paper that everything is based on, right? So we published a paper 2021 called Exit Strategy or Exit Trap, Basic Income and the Power to Say No in the Age of Precarious Employment. The paper is available for free, so by all means, click the link, look it up and just download it. It's good to have free stuff all the time. The point of this paper really is to engage with the argument proposed by Karl and a number of other people that, that basic income really gives us the power to say no in the context of the labor market. But and so, you know, so Simon and I are skeptical about this, but it's very important. I just want to have it on the record that this doesn't mean that we're against basic income. We think basic income is really, really interesting in all sorts of scenarios, right? Not even are we against basic income in the labor market context. We think basic income can do a lot of interesting things in the labor market. So what we are trying to argue against, or at least raise some issues here, is against a very specific type of argument, right? So let's be very clear about this from the start. So what I want to do is I'll go quite fast to some of these preliminaries, because I think it's quite familiar to many people. And of course, other Simon, you know, first talk mentioned some of this as well. So what is basic income? Very, very briefly, regular cash transfer, 4 key conditions. It's individual, so it's not based on household. It's universal, so we're not talking about categorical benefits. We're not talking about means testing, at least not in the clean, if you like, you know, pure basic income version. Very importantly, it's unconditional. This, of course, is the condition that raises most of the debate, partly, right? And then, of course, it's also permanent. So this is meant to be the lifelong version. During COVID in the last few years, a lot of people have been talking about a variant of basic income, which is called, you know, temporary basic income or emergency basic income. But that's only meant to last 6 months, a year, maybe a bit longer. What we are talking about here, of course, is the proper version, which is permanent, lifelong, right? So far, so good. Very important, actually. I mean, within that general definition, there's a lot of variety. So basic income isn't just one idea. It really comes in a lot of different versions. And so we can think about different levels of payment, right? So Simon in the previous talk already mentioned a lot about, you know, experiments and pilots that go with the basic income at the level of, say, what's called the living wage, or, you know, the standard of living. Many proposals go below that as well. So we can see variation with that. We can see a lot of variation in terms of how this is going to be funded, right? Is this going to be income tax, VAT, other types of taxation? Which programs are going to get cut, and so on and so forth. And that's actually already the third factor. Very, very importantly, basic income can vary a lot in terms of how it interacts with existing policies. So that variation is actually quite important. It's something that's going to come back when we talk, you know, later in the paper, so to speak, or in the presentation, right? So here's one way to think about this. So I like to think of basic income as the platypus of welfare policy. So this is the platypus, right? It was very, very strange, cute little animal. So why do I think about this? Well, basic income is made up of different parts that all look very, very familiar from other types of policies. So you see that in the platypus, right? There's a little bit of different animals that seems to be, you know, fitted together in a single thing. So we're very tempted to think that we know what basic income is and does based on how it looks like other policies. But when you put all these things together, you really, really do get a very unique type of policy, you know, the same way the platypus is a very weird, unique type of animal. And of course, it's something that also invokes very strong reactions, right? Some people think it's the best thing ever, and some people absolutely hate it, right? So this is sort of, you know, thinking of basic income as the platypus of welfare policy has these components. It's very, very familiar, but when you really think about it, it's really, really unique, right? And it's one of the reasons why, maybe one of the reasons why people insist on doing all these pilots to really know how it's supposed to be working, right? One of the interesting things, as I've already mentioned, basic income comes in variations, if you like. So when we start thinking about questions like, what is it that the basic income is doing? Should we have it? It is really important to be specific about what type of basic income we are talking about. So Brian Berry, you know, a philosopher who passed away, I'm trying to think now when, about a decade ago, I'd say. He had this quote where he basically says, asking about the pros or cons of basic income is like asking about the pros or cons of keeping a feline as a pet without distinguishing between a tiger and tabby. So details matter. Again, this is a point that will come back when Simon starts really discussing the sort of objections we have to the exit strategy, right? So that by way of introduction around basic income. So let's now think about this thing called exit strategy. So the background to our paper is, as we said, is this idea of the power to say no. Basic income gives workers the power to say no, which means it improves their bargaining power by allowing them to exit or threatening to exit unless the employer meets certain demands, better pay, better working conditions, health and safety, not having to go to the boss's dinner parties, and so on and so forth, you name it, right? And here are just a couple of examples of people who've been making this claim. I mean, the middle is Karl's book, and Karl really pitched this power to say no point in the debate, but since then a lot of people really picked this up, right? So that's the background, and intuitively that seems a really interesting thing, right? So I mean, it really makes basic income this very sort of empowering, transformative type of thing. So it looks great and it sounds great and it smells great, if you like, right? So but let's dig a little bit deeper. So first of all, what is exit from employment? So we can actually distinguish three types of exit, and it's worthwhile keeping these in the background when we are sort of investigating this sort of issue. The first one we call weak exit. So weak exit is when you either temporarily or partially want to exit an employment relation. So for example, this means some people have a preference for part-time work, so you want to leave your full-time job and move to a part-time one. Some people want to take time out to retrain, to educate themselves. They want to take a personal sabbatical to focus on family, sick family member, take time off to be with the kids, you name it, right? There could be all sorts of reasons. But we call this weak exit because people really do still want to stay in the labor market, and they actually still want to stay with the same employer, provided they can, take some time out or reduce the time that they have to spend on the job, right? So that's weak exit. Then a stronger one, which we call strong exit. Of course, we're not getting any points here for, coming up with sexy names, but, weak exit, moving to strong exit. So this is exit from a specific employment relationship, a specific business or boss you work for, with the objective of looking for and accepting a different job, a better job. So very importantly, this is still, these people that want to go with strong exit have a preference for being in employment or for continuing to be in employment, right? They just don't like their particular work, their particular boss, and they just want to move around with that and hopefully get a better one, right? This is to be distinguished from radical exit, the much stronger form. Radical exit means that you exit the labor market altogether. You just refuse to become involved in any type of employment relation. So those are the people who may have a preference for self-employment. They don't want to work for someone else. They may have a preference for saying, look, I want to basically engage in meaningful voluntary work, right? I think all this work stuff is really not very helpful. There's all sorts of things we can do that is much more beneficial socially, personally, perhaps. Let's do this on a voluntary basis. Some people really want to go off the grid entirely, right? They go live on a little island, have their vegetable garden, have 2 chickens and a goat, and that's it. They're very happy with that, right? So what you see here is 3 different types of exit associated with, in a way, if you like, 3 different types of preference profiles, right? So it's important to keep these things separate in the background. So we now know what is exit, but what is the exit strategy, right? The exit strategy is something very specific. So the exit strategy involves an expressed readiness to leave one's present employer and look elsewhere for a better job, right? So there's a willingness to actually exit this particular employment relationship, and that exit is expressed. It's really people want to make it clear and saying that is what we're doing. It's interesting to compare this with a strike. So if you want, in the exit strategy, you want to quit the job, but you don't want to quit work altogether, right? This is very different from a strike, which Gurevich, a scholar who's been working on this topic on strikes, he basically calls strikes quitting work, not the job. When you were on strike, you're putting your work down, but you still have the same relationship with the same employer, right? So exit strategy and strike are sort of opposites in one sense, if you like, right? So the idea of a strategic exit is that it really is a bargaining strategy. So people here are retaining a preference for and a connection to the labor market. That's really, really key. But they want to bargain with their specific employer, right? So what that means is we are really, in this case, focusing on what we called before strong exit. So it's not so much about weak exit, the temporary leaving type of thing, you know, it's not that important, nor is it, very importantly, nor is it radical exit. This is not people who are happy to just leave the workforce, right? These are people who, ideally speaking, want to stay in the workforce. They just want to either get a better deal from their current boss or want to move to a different one who offers them a better deal, right? Okay, and it is really important because to the extent, and this is the point that Simon will work on a bit more, or will talk about a bit more, to the extent that, for example, exit means that you end up outside of the workforce under these sort of type of preferences, that's a problem, right? I mean, if what you want is have a better job, ending being unemployed, it's not a good thing, right? That's not really what you want, okay? So another final point then, key to the exit strategy is also the exit threat. So is the idea that you're willing to leave if certain conditions are not met, but mainly it's the idea that that's what you want to express. So you literally go to your boss in your job and knock on the door and saying that, here you go, I really insist on having better pay or some extra holiday or better health and safety in work, better food at work, you name it. And if not, I will take my business, i.e. my labor market, my labor power elsewhere. That is the threat, right? Okay, so sort of a little point here. Some of you, or many of you, may be familiar with Albert Hirschman's sort of famous work on exit versus voice, right? So the idea is that, you know, you can complain about things by exiting, voting with your feet, or you can complain about things by voicing complaints and entering some sort of deliberation and discussion. So it's very important, and when we talk about the exit threat, although you're using your voice, so to speak, you know, your expression, it is really part of exit, not of voice. Why? Because at the end of the day, this is action-oriented. I mean, you're expressing a willingness to leave. What is really doing the work, so to speak, is the leaving part. It's still voting with the feet, right? So 2 more slides and then I'm done here. Why exits? You know, why do we do all these things? So very, very briefly, there are conventional strategies for empowering vulnerable workers, you know, things that are already happening in different countries. So employment regulation is one thing. So the state comes in and basically says, look, we're going to put in laws that regulate hiring, firing, working conditions, payments, promotions, you name it, everything, okay? One option. At the radical end of this, there could be prohibition of certain jobs, could even be prohibition of working for certain types of people. So for example, sex work in many countries is prohibited. Working for the mafia is usually not the sort of thing that government like very much either. So there's prohibitions as a possible regulation strategy. And then of course, thirdly is representation or voice. You know, this is often associated with trade unions and often this is collective, right? So one of the interesting aspects, of course, is that exit is an individual type of feature and representation in a way is often collective. We're much stronger when we do this together and so on and so forth. So why not just stick with these three? Well, because people have identified problems with this, right? So for example, vulnerable workers can be jeopardized in all sorts of ways, right? They have different interests and it's often hard for, say, a state and employment regulation to keep track in all these ways. It's often hard, for example, for collective representation to necessarily be able to bargain on all these different things, right? It also can create insider-outsider competition and opposition. So, for example, we have trade unions that represent their own workers, but each trade union represents a different sector or represent a different group of workers within a sector and so on and so forth. So you get competition potentially. And then, of course, there's issues around complexity of rules and monitoring, bureaucratic discretion, possibility of bias and corruption, and so on and so forth. You put all these three together, the people who favor exit basically say that means that, you know, the solutions of employment regulation or prohibition or representation or less than optimal, we need something else. That something else is exit. So how is that meant to work? Well, of course, exit, some types of workers already have a very strong bargaining position. If you work in a factory that has a big, expensive machine and you're the only one who can work that machine, you can write your own ticket, right? I mean, you can go to the office of the boss and say, now, look, you know, I really need more money, I need more vacation, whatever. It's fine, you're going to get it. Of course, many people, and this is especially when we're thinking about precarious employment, many people don't have this. So the argument is that we need to give them something to further their bargaining position, their exit power, right? Their exit freedom. And that is supposed to be basic income. So what is the problem of basic income? Basic income, you know, this is a quote from Philip Pettit, who, you know, wrote about this specific issue. And he basically says, well, the most effective of all protections in the labor market would be one's ability to leave employment and fall back on a basic wage available unconditionally from the state, i.e. basic income. So how is this meant to work? Well, basic income is simple, it's universal, it's non-intrusive. By implication, that means it doesn't leave anyone behind, there's no gaps, there's no uncertainty. So it is this very strong floor. So in theory, at least, and you know, we'll see whether the theory holds up, but in theory, at least, basic income allows workers to leave a job or turn down a job offering with poor working conditions. It does this in two ways. It provides what we call a bridging income, right? That allows a transition. So if you're looking for another job, you could basically, you know, you basically could leave your one boss and then use basic income as a bridging income in order to transition to the next one. It could also be a fallback position in case no other job is to be found. So those are the two mechanisms, if you like, right? There's the bridging of positions and there's the fallback position. So that, in a nutshell, is how basic income fits with different types of exit and with the exit strategy. And now we're going to move to our critique of all this, and that is on to Simon. So Simon, I will leave it to you now.
Thanks, Jurgen. So if I can share my screen then.
Yes.
So let's move on then to our reservations in relation to this argument. What Jurgen has just said here, it's clearly it sounds very attractive. So why on earth would we like to challenge this kind of argument? Now the claim being made here by a number of authors is that a basic income would really help drive fundamental changes in the labor market. Basic income, a realistic basic income introduced within existing capitalist structures. And the first step of our criticism of this argument is to introduce certain arguments about the potential insufficiency of the basic income for providing an empowering exit option. So suppose we introduce a basic income. Would that be sufficient for empowering workers, for enabling workers really to improve their working conditions, for providing a threat of exit in a way that would boost their labor market prospects? Well, the first thing we do here is to identify a number of obstacles to exit that would remain in place, even if there is a basic income. So we discuss four main problems here that a basic income on its own can't really solve or address. Suppose we have a basic income, and we assume, I mean, realistically, that this would have to be a relatively meager basic income. Then employment would still be a gateway to other social rights. Pension entitlements, earnings-related social insurance, some countries' health insurance. So if I have a partner, when we have a child together and my partner comes home saying, look, I will jeopardize pension entitlements, I will jeopardize access to earnings-related parental leave and earnings-related unemployment and insurance and so on, because now there is this basic income to rely on, then I wouldn't be super enthusiastic. I don't know about you, but I mean, a responsible option would clearly be to be a bit cautious here. This would still be in play. And of course, as Jurgen mentioned, this clearly depends a lot on details and background context. So we're assuming here that that the basic income would have to be a partial basic income if it's supposed to be realistic. Another set of obstacles are related to the potential scarring effects of unemployment. Suppose we say no to an unattractive job. We dislike our job, we want to leave. Now, how will this affect our future labor market prospects? Clearly, we depend on our incomes, and there's a risk here that this step, I mean, exiting would be perceived as it's signals a lack of ambition. If we leave in the context of a conflict with our employer, for instance, we may jeopardize the possibility to get a good reference. There is a risk that we will lose our networks, that there will be kind of skill depreciation, that we will end up in a situation where we lose self-confidence, and it will be more difficult in the future to get a new job. Another thing to observe here is that typically the location of a job typically matters a lot to employees. So even if we would like a different job, there are practical obstacles for relocating. We depend on local family or neighborhood networks, and those networks are typically hard to replace or build up. Perhaps, a child has a good school, we don't want to leave that, or perhaps we need to attend to a frail parent or grandparent, and so on. So these are, also important social and economic obstacles for actually saying no to a job or rejecting a job, even if there is a basic income to rely on. Another aspect concerns the non-instrumental goods of work. So now many basic income proponents, of course, challenge what Philip van Parijs has referred to as the work fetishism of our societies. We may want that employment shouldn't be so important to us, to our sense of recognition and esteem, but still it is. If our reference group is kind of firmly steeped in this job-oriented culture, well, there tends to be a certain stigma or sense of shame attached to potential joblessness, and that is likely to hold people back when it comes to actually opting for exit, even if there is a meager basic income to rely on then. So there is a risk here. If we decide to take this risk, that we decide to leave or threaten to leave, there is a risk that this will actually be an end point. It's not just a bridge, but that will actually get stuck in this state of unemployment. And this takes us to what we refer to as a hollow threat objection to basic income induced exit. That is really key. If this is supposed to be empowering, this basic income and the threat of exit, it really needs to be a credible threat. And as we've seen, then workers will face a number of obstacles for exiting that basic income does not resolve. And if this is common knowledge, if everyone or most people, we're aware of these obstacles, these constraints, there are, if there are good reasons to think that workers won't actually leave, they may complain and so on, but it's unlikely that they will actually leave. Even if there's a basic income, employers will have no incentive beyond mere goodwill to actually improve employment conditions. So that's the first step of our argument. discussing, I mean, various reasons for, I mean, thinking that under realistic conditions, exit is actually likely to be a hollow threat. But we also want to take the argument one step further, and here's when we introduce the concept of an exit trap. So the weak version of our argument simply points to a number of reasons to think that the basic income might have rather limited effect or might be insufficient for providing a solid foundation for an exit strategy. This is the hollow threat objection. But there's also then a stronger version of the argument that it might even be the case that basic income could turn into an exit trap. Even though in the abstract it sounds very, I mean, promising, empowering, it might actually end up worsening the prospects of precarious workers relative to the status quo. Now that might sound strange, isn't that just, I mean, nonsense? Just think of it. Think that, okay, so we introduce a partial basic income gradually as this becomes kind of feasible, and surely people's bargaining power would be greater if they have, even if it's a meager basic income, that surely provides greater bargaining power relative to a situation where they don't have any basic income. David Kalnitsky has provided some experimental evidence from the Mincome context in the late 70s from Canada, the saturation site of that experiment, suggesting that the access to a guaranteed income that seemed to have a positive impact on wages, pushing wages upwards. So why would we make this argument that basic income would actually worsen conditions, turn into an exit trap? Well, first of all, if we look more closely at how this argument is presented by some of the key proponents of the exit argument, then it's very often presented as an alternative to the collective bargaining power of vulnerable workers. Our approach to this is that we want to take this seriously, I mean, as a realistic policy tool. But then there are certain achievability constraints that are not, I mean, these are not soft constraints. They're not likely to go away. They're pretty hard constraints that are budgetary constraints. I mean, that you want to provide a basic income that's actually economically achievable, but also political constraints. It's rather unlikely that we will have a basic income party, a radical basic income party that in a democratic election will gain a majority, that we could form a government with this, basic income party. That doesn't seem very likely that this will actually happen. Basic income proponents or proponents of this kind of argument have often said that what we need to see here is that the basic income should form part of a new social consensus that where we accept that we have a basic income, but in return then employers and pro-market oriented persons can embrace this, because we could have greater elements of deregulation and also elements of wage flexibility. So we can have a certain new type of compromise. And many of these contributions that Jurgen mentioned, Taylor, for instance, when making this argument, exit left, they really point to the limitations of collective bargaining, the role of labor unions. And we feel that there is a need here to bring back this discussion, to relate this discussion more systematically to the insights, the empirically grounded insights of comparative welfare state research. Now, whatever we may think about labor unions and class mobilizations, we shouldn't downplay the limitations of union-based strategies and some of the dangers involved in relying exclusively on such strategies. However, it's hard to dispute the firm empirical connection between class mobilization, that collective bargaining power, direct voice strategies, and decommodification. So if you look at the countries where we can actually see that that we have accessed social rights that provide people with high levels of personal independence, bargaining power in relation to the labor market, well, that tends to be in countries where this collective bargaining power, direct voice strategies have been very pronounced. So we think that that insight often is kind of absent in this discussion. Another thing to observe here is that when this claim is made, I mean, in our current in the contemporary context, the claim is made against the background of globalized slack labor markets, where, I mean, there's fierce competition for precarious jobs, right? So for every precarious worker that threatens to exit, there are scores of others waiting to take the vacant job. And there's also, we need to take a look at, have a closer look on the conditions and alternatives for precarious workers. Suppose I have this job. If I'm going to press this, I advance this exit strategy. If I don't get improved working conditions, I will leave. Well, that only makes sense if there are other jobs available, other better jobs available. But precarious workers, if you look at the empirical literature, often tend to move horizontally rather than vertically in the labor market. So either, I mean, you could exit and you get unemployed, or get a similar kind of job that you had previously. And if we have that context in mind, it's interesting also to introduce these considerations about the impact of automation and technological unemployment. Often we hear that automation, artificial intelligence, digital innovations, these processes are, you know, provide us with arguments for why a basic income is really promising and perhaps even necessary. In this context, though, there's an interesting interaction here between the bargaining power argument, the exit strategy as a basis for improved bargaining power, and these processes of automation. Because if there is low-cost technology available that would actually allow employers to do without precarious workers, then making the exit threat in such a context, in such a situation, may actually turn the basic income into an unemployment subsidy. So remember that the idea of strategic exit, it's made by people. I mean, the strategy is used here by people who really want to have a job. They want to have an attractive job to improve their prospects within the labor markets. And if this is what actually would happen, it's clearly not an improvement, that you would end up with a meager basic income in a condition of involuntary unemployment, being replaced by new technology. So these are the main considerations advanced in our paper for how this seemingly empowering solution might actually become counterproductive in relation to this objective of improving bargaining power for vulnerable workers. Now, are there ways to prevent the basic income from becoming part of an exit trap? Well, of course, we may want to use these scenarios and these potential risks and awareness of these risks constructively to flesh out the case for basic income in a way that would avoid these problems. For instance, we could really emphasize that we shouldn't have just a partial, modest basic income, but we really need to have a full basic income, offering a respectable, culturally defined standard of living. We could also emphasize that we would like to have a variety of social services in addition to the full basic income. It's really important that we could have investment in human capital. So if people can, in addition to the basic income, they can access high quality care, They could access free university education, high quality lifelong learning. They could get support for job matching, relocation, and things like that. That clearly would bolster the exit option, wouldn't it? And we may also want to develop new structures, new infrastructure of participation beyond the employment contract, strengthen opportunities for cultural work, unpaid care work, volunteering, to make employment less central for esteem and recognition. So more people in such a context might want to opt for what Jurgen referred to as radical exit. We may also want to emphasize that we shouldn't see this kind of individual exit as an alternative to collective bargaining. We should combine individual exit with direct voice strategy to ensure that they are really mutually reinforcing. That's a possibility explored by Eric Olin Wright, for instance, suggesting that if many people individually would opt for exit, having this full basic income to fall back on, then that could lead to a kind of wage escalation. Employers would fear a chaotic situation, and they would welcome strong unions to have an ordered situation, and to avoid inflationary pressures and so on. So taken together, these mechanisms would actually support collective bargaining power and so on. So in relation to this kind of scenario, I mean, this seems rather attractive. But this way of thinking, it really is more part of a real utopian considerations. Thinking about long-term aspirations in a rather speculative way can be a source of inspiration, imagination, but it seems really clear that we don't, in this kind of vision, doesn't really tell us how a modest, realistic basic income phased in within existing capitalist structure would actually bring us closer to this kind of situation that would actually help trigger or support the dynamics envisaged by Eric Olin Wright and others. And perhaps just a final remark on this, another point that we make in relation to these alternatives. I mean, in this type of scenario, relating back to some of Kalnitsky's results, it's kind of interesting if we think that actually in this situation where it's actually become realistic for people to partly opt out of work, that people opt for radical exit, for instance, or people go for weak exit. Perhaps they spend more time, take longer parental leave, or they go into university studies, or they do other things. Now that might reduce competition for precarious jobs, and that might have the effect, that's a possibility, of actually increasing wages, improving conditions. If it might be possible to boost these kinds of processes, yes, we see that, well, there is a possibility perhaps that you could improve conditions for precarious workers. But we make a conceptual point here. I mean, what would be the mechanisms in this case? Well, the mechanism would be that this would be kind of the aggregate effects of impersonal forces of supply and demand. It would not be the effect of people saying that, I mean, making an explicit exit threat. So unless I get better wages, higher wages, or more meaningful work, I will leave. That's not what happens in this scenario. But it's really more the outcome of some people, increasing groups of people opting for weak exit or even radical exit. That might help boost the prospects of vulnerable workers. That's a possibility. But yeah, and I think that's I'll stop there and open up for discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Please unshare your screen. All right, now for my response. Well, I think these are very interesting ideas Jurgen and Simon have put forth. But I think there is actually really nothing here that is an argument against anything that I have said in my work on the power to say no. And if you were to try to apply it to say this is actually an argument against what I'm saying in these arguments, would be the naturalistic fallacy. Because what I'm looking at in this book is what is a just society? And what I argue is that, well, there's maybe a lot of things we need for a just society, but one of those, it is not enough to get away, to get rid of chattel slavery. But we also need to get rid of indirectly forced labor and indirectly forced other forms of subordination, such as a woman's subordination to a husband who holds power or who holds financial power over her. And what I'm saying is that if we don't do these things, our society is horribly unjust. If you say, well, these things aren't politically feasible in the short run or in the medium run or in the long run, that just says that our society is now and will be for the foreseeable future a horribly unjust society. It would not be a response to Frederick Douglass in 1861 to tell him, well, it's not real. I know you say you want full end of white supremacy and truly embrace of Black people as the full equals of white people, so there's no disadvantage whatsoever and be born with dark skin. Well, that's not politically feasible now. It won't even be politically feasible in 2022. The best we can do is eliminate slavery and make you all second-class citizens. That must be right. Well, that's not telling Frederick Douglass is wrong. That's just telling Frederick Douglass what an incredibly unjust society he lives in, and maybe telling some Black activists today how incredibly unjust our society is, which I think many of them are already aware of. So it's not really an argument of against what I'm saying here. Now, what it is then, what it is, since it's not really an argument against what I'm saying, it is a theory of second best. Well, it could be used at least in a theory of second best. So, okay, if assuming you agree that a truly just society would not be forcing people to work, and that's not feasible, and a basic income would be a very good tool to make it so we weren't indirectly forcing people to work with a choice of bosses. Since that's not feasible, it is not necessarily true that creating a really small basic income that doesn't give them that power is the next best step in that direction from a political perspective. It's a theory of second best. A perfectly competitive market would all have all these great features to say, well, and one of those features is no government regulation. So we have this horribly horribly uncompetitive market and government regulations. You just get rid of the government regulations. That's one of the things that creates a perfectly competitive market. But since you don't have a perfectly competitive market, those government regulations might be counteracting some of the other problems that exist in the market. So just getting rid of those government regulations, even though that's one of the things that is a characteristic of a perfectly competitive market, doesn't necessarily get you there. So it's a theory of second best of what, since a really just society isn't achievable, what is a step in the direction of justice that we might be able to take, and that is not necessarily the creation of a basic income or a basic income as high as we could realistically get it. Now that gets me to other comments. I think that you're unduly pessimistic about what is possible, because we never really know what's possible. The only thing we know is possible is the status quo. We don't know whether it's what changes in the status quo are possible. We don't know if it's possible to increase the child tax credit by $1. And also, people who want it lowered don't know whether it's physically possible to lower it by $1. We don't really know what's feasible. The question is about trying and trying. And as Frederick Douglass says, you got to agitate and keep agitating, keep agitating. When you live in an unjust society. And I think sometimes things that seem politically complete political non-starters change. In the 1850s, it didn't look like we were going to be 20 years from now, we were going to have a society in the United States, we're going to have a society without slavery. But it happened. In 1925, it did not look like by 1945, the United States, it didn't look seen at all politically feasible. The United States was going to have a pretty decent social welfare system by 1945, but it happened. In the 1970s, and then 1980s, when I was growing up, the guaranteed income looked a lot more politically feasible. It looked like on the edge of political feasibility in the early 1970s, but same-sex marriage looked completely impossible. So sometimes what we think looks impossible actually becomes possible way quicker than we think it would be. If you polled people in 1970, which is going to happen first? Same-sex marriage or negative income tax? Negative income tax would have won that like 95% to 5%, and they'd all been wrong. I don't think we should let pessimism about what's possible hold us back from agitating about what's coming up. Now, but also, so now those are another thing is that I realized from reading when I read your paper the first time, I realized that I was speaking about this really in a particular setting, and that a particular setting and a particular thought about the labor market, that setting was I'm responding to the argument that, if you could create basic income, nobody will work, or at least somebody won't work, and that's horrible. It's terrible that if you introduce a basic income and people don't work. Actually, it's not so horrible because we've got really crap jobs right now, and people ought to have the power to say no to them. Now, your argument could be just as much a response to those people, just as mine is, to those people who say basic income is going to cause everybody to leave the labor market. Well, actually, it's not going to cause many people to leave the labor market if you put in the kind of basic income that we're likely to get. But their response to that, well, the camel gets his nose under the tent, and pretty soon the whole camel's inside the tent. They've got a response to your sort of an argument, whether it's realistic or not, I don't know. But that's the sort of response they would give to you. But if that is the kind of argument that I'm entering when I bring this, and that actually was really left out of your look at this, not even looking at that angle of argumentation against basic income. It went on to saying, well, does it achieve all these things I want? Well, even if it doesn't achieve all these things, if it relieves the suffering of the people at the bottom, it's an important step in the right direction. And I'll take any sort of the people at the bottom are being treated so unjustly. I'll take any step at that. But another thing that I realized, one thing that I really realized from reading your paper about is that I was looking at the labor market. Not only was I responding to a particular record, but I was looking at the labor market in a particular way. And you open up to my looking at it in a different way, but also you're not looking at it in the way that I am. You're looking at an uncompetitive labor market where there's lots of bargaining power, perhaps at least on one side, maybe on both sides. I was really more thinking about a competitive labor market. Now, people put, I'm not necessarily a perfectly competitive labor market, but a competitive labor market in the sense that both buyers and sellers just buy at the going rate in most occasions. There's usually no benefit in raising wages because you get the same employers with the same skills, and it just costs you more and your profits go down if you're an employer. And there's no benefit in really lowering the wages much below the going wage because there's so many other employers that people could work for. Even though there's some workers unemployed all the time, they're going to be looking for people who pay the going wage. Thinking about going wage. And I think actually the lower you get in the market, the more it's competitive because you've got lots of jobs where the training doesn't work right. The same people can work in a meat packing plant as can work in the service industry and work as janitors and work as lots of other things. There are many of these people now, but people portray competitive markets as being good, but there's nothing necessarily good about them because all the competitive market means is you get the going rate. Well, if the going rate is based on some really rich people looking to increase their profits and a whole large pool of other people who are going to be homeless if they don't get a job pretty soon, the going wage rate is going to be very low. So I'm not thinking really about what you were talking about, weak exit or strategic exit or radical exit, but more like what I would call casual exit, that there are no jobs that I'd rather have than living off basic income, assuming the basic income is large enough to live on, even if it's not very good, not one that a middle class worker would use strategically, but one that a very low class worker would just prefer to working in a meatpacking industry, which used to be good jobs and now really terrible jobs. That sort of thing. If I would prefer this to the jobs available to me, I will take that job. I'm not really thinking so much strategically, but this idea, where coming from the people who are opposed to basic income, that, well, there are people who might not work. Well, if there are people who won't work when they've got a poverty line income or just a little more than that, which is a really low income, there are people who do not like the job offers at that point and they choose not to. That is a good thing from their point because we shouldn't be forcing them to take those jobs. And I'm just thinking about people who, maybe if a better offer comes along, I'll take it. We'll see what the job offers are. It's not that I'm opposed to working. It's not that I've made a big decision about it. But just that I don't like the job offers. Not so much strategic. It's just that the job offers I don't like, or the offers I see I don't like. Now, for the people who might be able to be, but wonder if I should have paid more attention to these two sort of different motivations, to the strategic motivation. I said really very little about the strategic motivation, but I don't think the individual power that UBI gives you is in any way opposed to the collective power that unionization gives you. And I think it inherently strengthens it for reasons that Eric Olin Wright talked about. Right now, unions have to save a lot of money to create a strike fund so their workers aren't going to lose their apartment while they go on strike. And what tends to break a strike is if a company can hold out so that strike fund is exhausted. If a UBI is large enough to live on, the strike fund is inexhaustible and they can stay on strike for a long time. They don't need to save up to do it. It becomes more cheaper to form a union. I also would think about back to the more competitive market. We have a situation in the United States, it might be particularly the United States, where although some things are tied to employment, some other things, it's harder to get those things that are tied to employment. Those tend to come in at a higher level. You get a lot of people who have to, in order to make ends meet, have to work 3 part-time jobs that was actually working overtime. You work 60 hours a week for 20 hours at 3 jobs, and that way, none of those employers have to pay your health insurance. And you're working 20 hours more than a standard work week. You're working overtime and you're considered part-time everywhere you work. Someone like that, even with a relatively small basic income, might be able to quit one of those jobs. And quitting one of those jobs might actually have a significantly effect on the wages and working conditions in those low-paid sectors. How much it will, I don't know. But if anybody is able to do that, it's helping to relieve the suffering of some of the worst off people, not to mention the homeless. And so I think even if a basic income that's politically feasible is a lot lower than what I think is really just and what I argue is just, I think we should be moving in this direction. And I'll let you guys respond and then go to open questions. That's a lot to respond to. You might not want to respond to all of that.
Okay. Well, Karl, thanks very much for all that. So yeah, I'll pick a few points and then I'll leave the hard stuff to Simon, yeah? So, okay, I mean, so first of all, I mean, you know, you've made several points that basically boil down to the fact that you're doing different stuff that we're doing. And you know, and to some extent, that's fine. I mean, you talk VHS and we talk Betamax or the other way around. And, you know, and we're perfectly happy to accept that. And I think in fairness to us, there's nothing in our paper that says that we're now writing a paper against Karl Widerquist or against Karl Widerquist's idea, right? So I think yes, there is a difference between thinking in terms of whatever, you know, ideal type theory of justice and the power to say no is part of that and so on and so forth, which is what you do. And then, but there are quite a few people, you know, I mean, you may not have intended it this way, but there's quite a few people who've either taken, let's say, the one line version of, you know, of your account, you know, the power to say no, or that have come up with it separately and then just use the terminology, so to speak. There's quite a few people who are making claims that really do boil down to strategic exit type of things. So I mean, you know, I mean, it's perfectly fine what you're doing. It's also, we think at least, it's perfectly fine what we're doing and saying that, hold on, if you're making these sort of claims about what basic income is really doing today and can be doing today, then we need to be really, really serious about looking at what is really happening or likely to happen and so on and so forth. So again, I mean, you know, one thing that's quite important in our paper is we're not even that interested in sort of hacking strategic exit or the exit option apart, so to speak, right? Like we're not fundamentally saying, you know, this whole strategic option thing is a total doofus and, you know, we should just leave it. And by implication, we should leave basic income and out of the labor market and so on. We don't actually, we're quite explicit in the paper that we're not doing this. So what is it that we're doing? Well, one of the ways to read what we're trying to do is to say, if we're taking exit options today, seriously, if we're taking the strategic side of it also seriously today, right, then a number of things follow. So one of the things that follows, for example, is that we need to start really looking into, for example, what are the potential impact of basic income in terms of strategic bargaining for very, very different types of workers in very, very different types of sectors, right? And I'm pretty sure, Karl, that you agree with that statement, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but no one is doing it yet, right? We're at a stage when it comes to this line of argument where either we're doing the stuff that you're doing, which is we're talking about theories of justice and how that fits in there, which is fine, or people are making very general claims very, very general claims, and they try to generalize, and it's like, well, we have basic income in the labor market, and therefore some people may choose to take the money and run, so to speak, and therefore this creates the power to say no for everyone. Like I'm making a caricature, right? But I mean, you know, you and I and Simon as well, we've been doing this for a couple of decades now. Every basic income argument goes through the phase where it is a theory proposition, and then it becomes very generalized, and then we start doing the research where we start really into the nitty-gritty, and how is this really supposed to work? How does it work in different types of labor market? How does it work with different types of workers? How does it work in different sectors? How does it work in different countries with different welfare states? And so on and so forth. So in a way, if you like, you can read our argument to say, if we want to take the exit option seriously today, that's where we need to move now. We need to do a lot of work to really try to figure out. And in a way, our paper offers a number of reasons to be a bit skeptical about high-level generalization, so to speak, right? So if you will, that's one way, I think, in which our research agendas are compatible, even if they don't directly speak to each other. I hope that makes sense. So.
Yeah, it does. And I should say, I haven't given enough thought to the higher level workers, because really the worker who has a genuine exit option, who actually they can live off the money and live decently, and so what because the justification of the power to say no is just like, well, if you take a job, it should be well enough that you would take it even though you have this option. That job still might be unjust because you're not getting an equitable share of society's product for your labor, and how high does basic income have to be? So once you get beyond that point, you're talking about basic income as a tool for something more than giving people independence, but also creating a more equal and equitable society. Can basic income do that? That's an important question. It's not been my main area of concern. I think it can, and I do agree with you that it's got to get higher and higher to do that. For the most part, I agree with. I also do agree with you that the market is competitive in some ways and not so much in other ways. That often, if you raise the income of the lowest tier and improve their working conditions, then the next tier finds it easier to demand higher, and so forth, and it can cascade up from like that. So that, in a sense, I do think it is a tool to fight inequality, but I also think it might be introduced at a level that's too low to be a very effective tool to fight inequality, as well as it could be introduced too low to really establish a new realistic independence.
So let me thank you also, Karl, for these comments. My general thoughts and impressions were similar to those of Jurgen. I mean, when I listened to you, I felt that, I mean, we're not engaging here with kind of an ideal theory type of argument, obviously, I fully agree with what you're saying, that we mustn't let pessimism hold us back, and it's obviously really important with ideal theory type of exercises. I've been involved in those kinds of debates myself quite a lot, and I mean, trying to kind of push the limits of our imagination and I mean identify paths forward. I mean to identify desirable futures. But I also think that it's I mean, the claims we're making in this argument, in this particular argument, it's something very specific. It's on this particular idea of phasing in a realistic form of basic income within existing capitalist structures. Would that actually bring us closer to such an idea? I think it's really important to address these kinds of claims, whether or not you make those claims. I mean, this is really not. I mean, we like your phrase very much. This power to say no. It's a very good expression, of course, but it is clearly a staple in basic income discourse, and this general idea of basic income as a foundation for boosting bargaining power. I mean, the power to say no, and so I think it's important to address these kinds of ideas and claims in a sober and empirically informed way. I mean, if we share the same kind of values clearly here, but I mean, if we want to get closer to a more ideal state. We want to get there, but we also want to stay there. We don't want to just to end up in a situation where our efforts become counterproductive. And I think there's kind of, I think it's important to bring in comparative welfare state research in this context. And even though perhaps you're not making these kinds of claims, but I do think that both Lovett and Taylor and others are making them. I mean, where people are really present exit and individual exit as an alternative to well, union power, collective bargaining power, I think they do run into some of these the difficulties that we are pointing to here. And I mean, for instance, if you look at Philippe van Parijs, if you look at, I mean, his way of addressing some of these questions and proposing basic income as a foundation for a new kind of social consensus, he really thinks about this as something that would allow us. And Friedman was mentioned in the earlier talk here. Move beyond regulation to move beyond union power, and also to enable wage flexibility. And I think there is I mean, if we do introduce this kind of realistic low basic income gradually as an alternative to more traditional conventional measures with a greater emphasis on collective bargaining power, as he proposes, well, then we may not only we have a situation where we kind of accept precarization processes, but we also tend to accelerate them, right? That we'll have more low-paid jobs. We'll have and a situation where, I mean, certain key mechanisms that help to kind of shape but also sustain more egalitarian arrangements are weakened. I mean, there's a very clear risk there that I think this type of argument is not sufficiently sensitive to. So yeah, it's just
okay. Okay, now we have two people in the queue with questions. So first we have Simon März. Simon?
Yep. Doing it. Hi.
All right.
So thank you guys for the paper and the talk. And it's really just I really appreciate that you asked the questions that a lot of people don't seem to ask in detail. And I like that kind of research. Really appreciate it. I was wondering about the research of David Kalnitsky, because he does it especially in the MINCOM pilot, and where as much as I remember that paper, he basically claims that he was able to see that social stigma doesn't seem to seems to lower over time, and so I wondered how you're able to pick this up, especially because one of the strongest claims, and I totally agree to that in that sense, that is social stigma, which prevents people from exiting jobs. But how does that research / that claim tie into what you are arguing?
So Kalnitsky basically researched, I mean, the research of Kalnitsky that ties into our paper is not that paper, right? He's written several. He also did a paper where he actually looks at the, very specifically the link between employees and employers. That's the one you want to read. Okay. In order to understand how because we have an ongoing debate with David Kalnitsky, basically, right? So he's a lot more optimistic than us. But one of the things that, we find ourselves slowly converging on sort of, if you like, an agreement where, if you like, there are different mechanisms. So there's a threatening bargaining type of mechanism, and then there's the aggregate effect of people actually exiting. right? And so one of the really interesting things is under what conditions is one effect more likely to occur and the other, and under what conditions, for example, can they mutually reinforce each other or not, and so on and so forth. So I mean, if you like, we're at the very, very early stages to even start thinking about these sort of things. But one thing that's well worth considering is that at the end of the day, the data that that David Kalnitsky, I mean, he does really some of the most interesting research in my view, but it is based on a very specific experiment in a very specific context that was a long time ago, right? So there is a genuine question to whether the findings that he finds in a rural community in the 70s in Manitoba can be generalized in a much, much more open economy where, you know, issues around globalization and automation and technological unemployment feature, right? Where precarization is a staple and so on and so forth, right? Okay. But in a way, what we appreciate about David's work is that he's really getting at some of these mechanisms, and that's what we need to do as well. So the people, kind of coming back to our paper, if you like, the people who genuinely think that basic income will give you bargaining power in our sort of current type of economy, they're trying to do, I mean, this is effectively a different type of mechanism. So if anything, our paper is trying to separate out some of these things, you know. The next step, if you like, is to do, try to get to empirical research and experimental research. I actually have a PhD student in Finland who's doing some lab experiments to try and test out some of this exactly. So with a bit of luck, you know, some more data-driven stuff will come forward in the next year or so.
Okay, next question is from Otto Leto. Otto, unmute and turn your video on.
Oh, hey. So yeah, thanks so much.
You're muted.
Oh, I did click the. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Start over. I accidentally muted you. Sorry.
Ah, okay, okay. So yeah, it's good to see you all. Jurgen, Simon 1 and Simon 2, and Karl, everybody else. So the paper, as usual, from you is very informative and rich, and there's so many threads there that could be followed and should be followed. At the same time, sometimes I feel a bit like I've witnessed a bull go through a china shop, in the sense that, you know, lots of things were in a way attacked and broken down in a way that it's not clear what the constructive way forward is. You know, this is fine. But I think this leads to precarity of basic income research, which is kind of its own form of precarity, is what to do next. But the and also, you know, we've already heard about the tiger and the tabby and the camel. I guess we should add the bull to the list of mammals in this list of basic income animals. But what I want to really focus on is a very simple question here, which is the role of unions and the relation between voice and exit here. Now, of course, it's very easy to say we should combine them, and you know, I'm sure Eric, Olin Wright, and others have contributed constructive ways to do that. But this framing of the issue in your paper is a bit too narrow in terms of the. I mean, it's sort of good for one paper, I suppose, to frame it this narrowly in terms of the relationship being the singular path. It's the singular dependency relation between employers and workers, right? So you're focusing on the issue of the dependency relation between them, and the employees are modeled as having very narrow, very narrow preferences in terms of desiring a job, and not necessarily much beyond that, which is fine. But it seems to me that one of the things that bringing in the voice dimension threatens here is first of all the sort of, if we take the idea that employees not only want job, but they want a good job, they also want to have they also need to have the option of choosing their job, and I think the introduction of voice arrangements, whether it's collective bargaining arrangements through unions, or whether it's direct employee employer sort of channels of communication, might and especially if we introduce the government sort of government-backed voice channels into the mix, which at least there's this kind of entanglement of countries and other countries which focus largely on these kind of multilateral arrangements. You often get in a sort of entanglement of dependency relations, and this entanglement of dependency relations, you could see it's good for job security often, but it also could be, it sort of creates its own trap, right? So voice could also be a trap in the sense of leading people to be trapped in places where they don't want to be, which was precisely the problem that we wanted to solve. And so if you think that what we're trying to solve is the problem of making sure that people are not stuck in a place where they don't want to be, perhaps we should worry about the trap caused by this entanglement of dependency relations with unions and with government-backed organizations to provide security at the cost of reducing the ability of people to get to a sort of job security that actually would be better for them. So in a way, it could lead to a Nash equilibrium that actually is a trap, a voice trap, not just an exit trap.
Okay, Jurgen and Simon, you're both muted.
So thank you very much. You disappeared there now and then, so I didn't hear your entire argument, unfortunately. But thanks for the remark. And it's I think what you're saying here is in part rather similar to what I mean, arguments developed both by Taylor and Lovett. I mean, discussing the limitations of direct voice strategies, and I wouldn't disagree with that. I think, I mean, and also obviously there are these insider outsider issues, and that labor unions won't deal with all relevant interests, and I think, I mean, some of the arguments mentioned there by Jurgen in his introductory remarks, that basic income offers a nice remedies to some of these problems, that it really avoids this intrusiveness, and it might be, I mean, really offer some a good complement to some of these to deal with some of these problems, limitations, and dangers of direct voice strategies, and then perhaps we need to have a closer look at the particular voice mechanisms that you were thinking of here to address your concerns more thoroughly. But I wouldn't want to disagree with any of that. But I do think that it's really crucial, I mean, to have the insights, the empirically grounded insights of empirical comparative welfare state research in this context. I mean, there are some debates here going on in separate compartments, unfortunately. And I do think that, I mean, there are some really key indicators of decommodification and also defamiliarization. I mean, that there's a very firm empirical link here between specific forms of collective I mean, class mobilization, direct voice, and these outcomes that would be desirable for someone really wanting to boost these, I mean, the bargaining power of these precarious workers. But of course, I mean, we shouldn't take it for granted that the solutions of the past are also offer the best solutions to our current or future problems. And I'm not, you know, a fan of this kind of nostalgic social democratic program. I mean, I think that the basic income offers some really important, I mean, basic income activism and basic income real utopian theorizing here provides some really crucial insights, and it really alerts our attention to important problems, important experiences, and interests that have been, I mean, kind of traditionally left out by proponents of direct voice strategies. Now, Jurgen, do you want to help me or add? Dig deeper into some
I mean, not sure about helping, but definitely want to add. So, I mean, so kind of literally adding to what Simon was already saying. I mean, of course, we can, you know, we can have a very separate debate about what is the role of unions, if anything, you know, and some people are very much in favor and some people are very much against, etc., etc. And we can have a similar debate about basic income. But I guess our take is that in order to then have a judgment about, you know, should we go more to the voice direction or more to the exit direction, or should we have a combination of these things? At the very minimum, we need to really understand what's going on. And if anything, you know, one of the things that we had a problem with is that at the basic income side, so to speak, all you got was a very generalizable claim, and then let's just throw that out there and just assume that everything will be hunky-dory and we'll have unicorns and pink rainbows or whatever it all is, right? You know, that's not what's going to happen. So I guess what we're proposing is that, well, let's really get down to the nitty-gritty and look at the pros and cons of the basic income exit strategy, and then let's compare it with the union strategy. And it may well be that for certain people, the balance really is still in favor of basic income. And it may also be that, you know, the balance is in favor of basic income in certain countries rather than in other ones, and so on and so forth, right? I'll just make one final quick call, and this quick comment. This is something that also ties in with something that Karl said before. I mean, you know, Karl basically mentioned and said that, well, you know, you shouldn't think of basic income as being against trade unions, and we should just combine these things. And to some extent, we hear that a lot, right? A lot of people say, well, you know, of course, we want to put these things together, and then the strike fund might be one argument in favor. But there are countering arguments as well. I mean, you know, there's no doubt, I think, in my mind at least, that if you introduce a basic income in certain ways, that this may affect, you know, whether or not people will want to join a trade union. Now, you may think that that's a good thing and that's a separate type of argument, but at the very minimum, we want to understand these effects, and to simply say we're going to combine them is kind of a bit wishful thinking. What we really want to understand is under what conditions can this combination be achieved in a way that actually does the work it's supposed to be doing, right? So at the end of the day, you know, our paper and our approach is an invitation for many people to basically say, look, let's just take this seriously as a topic in social science, so to speak, in comparative welfare state research, and so on and so forth. And let's do some real work around this and then see how far it gets us, right? And then we can link it back for sure into all the normative considerations as well, right? Whether this is about problems with, you know, domination and the trade unions like you raised and Lovett and Taylor raised, or whether this is really broad, full-on social justice account like Karl is proposing, and so on. So all these things are relevant, right, in that sense, right? But let's do the work. Let's do the real work as well.
All right, we are way over time. Thanks to everybody who stayed late. And on behalf of the platypus, the cat, the camel, the bull, and the unicorn, I thank the speakers and everyone who participated, and wish you all a good night or a good morning or afternoon, depending